In 1991, the world experienced a series of transformations that forever changed the course of history. It was as if that year tore apart the fabric of time, separating the before from the after in an irreversible way. However, when reflecting on that period, we are left with a paradoxical feeling. The memory of a world in ruins, mixed with the idea of new beginnings, makes us wonder, what if that year could be erased from collective memory? What if what happened in it was merely a distant nightmare that never occurred? Perhaps we could avoid the long echoes of its consequences. The world was crumbling, reconfiguring, and the great powers, one by one, began to collapse or rise with a new role. In 1991, countries disappeared, others were born, and borders were redrawn in unexpected ways. Some of the largest powers of the 20th century vanished in the blink of an eye, while the New World Order took shape aggressively. Geopolitics was in an abrupt transition, and in this context, the United States emerged as the only uncontested superpower on the planet. The world of 1991, the end of an era. The year began tensely, with the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. The first major event that caught global attention was a war no one expected, but which triggered a series of transformations. On January 6th, Georgian forces attacked the city of Tskhinvali in South Ossetia. It marked the beginning of the South Ossetia War, a conflict that would later be recognized as one of the key moments in the Soviet disintegration. Georgia, which had already declared independence in 1990, was decisively breaking away from Moscow, and this was a fatal blow to the already fragile Soviet Union. This act of aggression, though seemingly local, had global repercussions. And years later, in 2008, Russia would return to reclaim this territory, sparking a war whose reverberations are still felt today. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, tensions were escalating. In January 1991, U.S. diplomat James Baker met with then Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz, desperately trying to persuade Iraq to withdraw its troops from Kuwait. But diplomacy failed, and relations between the two countries began to deteriorate irreversibly.
This clear expression of the Congress represents the last best chance for peace. As a democracy, we've debated this issue openly and in good faith. And as President, I have held extensive consultation with the Congress.
On January 12th, the U.S. Congress approved the use of military force to expel Iraq from Kuwait, preparing the ground for the Gulf War. Gulf War, the beginning of a new chapter. With the diplomatic efforts failing and tensions escalating, the international coalition, led by the United States, launched a military offensive in the Persian Gulf. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began, with heavy bombings and airstrikes targeting Iraqi positions. On the same night, Iraq responded by launching Scud missiles at Israel, retaliating. But this war, which initially seemed like a simple regional conflict, quickly became something much more. The world, in a sense, was more polarized than ever. However, this war was not the only one shaking the planet that year. In Eastern Europe, the pressure for independence was growing daily. In late January, the Soviet army attacked Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, attempting to prevent the independence movement that was gaining momentum in the country. Lithuania, which had proclaimed its independence in 1990, was not willing to submit to the Soviet regime. Like Georgia, Lithuania became a symbol of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. The Soviet collapse. The end of an era of division. In February 1991, a series of events began unfolding, all pointing to the inevitable collapse of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact crisis and the growing pressure from republics seeking independence culminated in a series of declarations of independence by many of the countries that were once part of the USSR. Estonia and Latvia were the first to follow the path to independence in February and March, symbolizing the collapse of the Soviet foundations. In the same month, a wave of uprisings and conflicts broke out in various parts of the world. While the Middle East was engulfed in war, Africa also found itself in turmoil. The civil war in Somalia erupted, creating a situation of complete chaos and instability that would persist for decades. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of Soviet institutions, the world was about to enter a new political phase. The dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991 was another symbolic milestone marking the end of the Cold War. Russia, the largest of the former Soviet republics, was not only witnessing the regime's decline, but also preparing for a new role on the international stage. The rise of the United States. However, the biggest winner of that turbulent year was undoubtedly the United States. After Iraq's defeat in the Gulf War, the only remaining global superpower after the Soviet collapse, the United States proclaimed its uncontested leadership over the planet. For the first time in decades, the world was unipolar. On December 26, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev officially announced the end of the Soviet Union. The impact of this announcement was global. Real socialism, which had dominated a substantial part of the planet for more than 70 years, disappeared, leaving the world with a new political configuration. In addition to military confrontations and the decline of powers, 1991 was also a year of radical geographical changes. Countries like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan declared their independence, dissolving the former Soviet bloc and fragmenting the world into new nations and identities. These political and social changes were not merely numerical. The world became more fragmented than ever. Entire countries disappeared from the map, and at the same time, new nations began to emerge, each with its own complexities, challenges, and expectations. The impact of 1991 is still felt today. The wars that broke out during this period did not end with the conflicts. They created deep-rooted issues in many countries, especially in the Middle East and the Balkans. The legacy of the Gulf War still shapes international policies, while territorial disputes in the former Yugoslavia continue to generate conflict. Additionally, American hegemony over the planet was solidified, but it also led to challenges as new powers emerged. Russia, although devastated in 1991, still represents a significant force in the global arena. The growing rise of China also began to gain strength in this period, although it became more evident in the following decades. Ultimately, 1991 was the year that split history in two. The world that existed before that year, a world divided by the Cold War and ideological tensions, was replaced by a new world where the balance of power was in constant flux. The consequences of this are still evident today, as the shadows of decisions made over 30 years ago continue to affect our political and social reality. In summary, 1991 was not just the end of one cycle, but the beginning of a new era. A year of tragedies and victories, destruction and creation, which at the same time is hard to forget and impossible to ignore.